All right, I think we should be live. How's it going, everybody? My name is Travis, and we're just checking in with everybody. We wanted to have a little talk about some of the game concepts we have going on that we've been working through, and so we're popping up.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. Hoping we can start reaching some folks and get people excited about our game. My name's Seth, and we want to talk to you about our game Altered World.
So we were trying to figure out what's the right thing to talk about today, and we figured we'd start with we've had a post about this, but it's a concept that's fairly unique, and we think that it's worth talking about. It's called Nayasch. Um, Altered World doesn't really have classes in the way that most role playing games do. Um, if you think of a class or a character class as a predefined set of abilities that you opt into at character creation. Um, we don't have that at all. It's a
And
100%.
those features of a class often kind of point you towards one of a few roles that you can play in a
Right.
party, right? So you have your class, which is the mechanics that tell you what your character can do, and the role, which is kind of the job you want to fill in the party.
Yeah. Yeah. So like a martial class or a fighter in the D20 system can be a striker, they can be a ranged attacker, they can be a tank that's just there to soak damage. There's a couple different ways you can play that character and still be within that same bucket. Um, but what that does lend itself to is you lose a little bit of creativity in what you can do with your character because um, you've got a predefined set of abilities. And from a designer's perspective, that's in some ways that's kind of nice because it's easier to balance the system. It's is the really all you're doing is you're comparing a set of abilities from one class to another, um, and trying to make them so that they're roughly equal in power. Um, Altered World is not like that. It's very much balance is achieved basically by saying everybody gets to start with the same number of creation points for character creation, and then what you do with those is kind of up to you. Um, so if you step back from the idea of a character class being a set of abilities that your character has that define what your character can and can't do mechanically within the game, what we ended up with is something called Nayasch. And it's called Nayasch as a immersion building technique. The word Nayasch is a word from a language that's in the game. And so that's why it carries over. And why we chose to use it. But rather than defining your abilities, what Nayasch does is really more tell you how your abilities work. I think really the easiest way to explain this is to kind of walk through a couple of examples of, you take a given power, say fireball that everyone loves, and how those are different among the different Nayashi, because there's 5 powered Nayashi. So what do you think, Seth? How would you start with that?
Well, I mean, I love the example, right? Fireball is an iconic spell, and everybody does love it. Um, and so the idea that you can choose one of these different Nayashi, and any one of them gets to have access to Fireball if they want to spend the points to have it. Uh, and then, like you say, how do you get to use that Fireball? What are the mechanics like? That's where the distinction starts to be made. So let's see, let's list off all the Nayasch. You've got Mage, you've got Sorne, you've got Ninshane, you've got Priest, and you've got Calcatro, right? So these are all different ways of accessing powers. They have access to all the powers. Any
Right.
one of them can use any of the powers. Some might be better at some powers than others, but that just lets you have a lot of flexibility and creativity when you're deciding how to make your character. And that's a point we try and emphasize with just about everything in this game, is giving players the power to be creative and make characters and tell stories that they want to do.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, right? To contrast it against the D20 system that basically everybody's going to be familiar with, rather than having a list of spells that are used by a given class. So you have a spell list for wizards and a spell list for artificers and a spell list for warlocks, and those are all different and distinct. What you have are a list of powers, and any of the Nayashi can use any of those powers if they choose to purchase them.
And not to put too fine a point on it, but if you choose not to have powers, if you go with the normal Nayash, um, there are certain ways you can have access to powers if money can buy them through technology.
Right.
So not every power is up for that, of course, but some of them are for sure. And in a cyberpunk science fiction fantasy kind of world, the doors are pretty wide open there. So there's plenty of paths to get to the same location.
Yeah, and so with the five Nayashi that you listed off, right? There's the, as you said, the mage, priest. Those are two that are relatively accessible, like understanding like what that is, right? So you have priests channel the power of a god, mages cast spells functionally, um, and so um, the biggest difference between those two is in um, the way that the power ratings end up, right? A
Mhm.
priest can cast a fireball at any rating to which their god has access to that power. It may take them a really long time to pray for that power, but they could pray for a fireball that could nuke a city if they were so
Right.
inclined.
Whereas the
Um,
mage has to learn a spell, a
right,
dedicated spell. And if they decide that they want Fireball and they get it at rating 5, then okay, they have that spell at rating 5. And unlike other systems, where you can only cast it maybe a few times per day or whatever, that limitation is not just inherent to the power in our system. Though, if you want to, you can put it there for different reasons. The difference with the mage is if they ever want that rating to change, they have to, in effect, learn the spell again at the new rating, and
yeah,
that isn't a showstopper necessarily, uh, but they can't raise the rating of a power once they've learned it. They just have to learn a new spell at the
right.
higher rating.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that, and it's one of the things I like about the system with mages in particular, is I find it very interesting the idea that you have to be cautious with the rating of the power that you're exercising. Right, that if your power rating, if you're casting a spell that has a rating that's too high, you can do uh, mental or physical damage to yourself, and could even turn yourself into a burned out husk
Yeah.
were you so inclined to go that far.
Yeah, if you really mess up, that can happen. It's not likely, but that gets into discussions of level, which I'm sure we'll talk about in another video, because
Yeah,
it's a whole nother mechanic, and it works very differently than it does to other games. So it'll be fun to talk about that. So that's the first two Nayashi. You got priests and your
yeah,
mage, and those words at least people are familiar with. The other three that I listed off just probably sound like nonsense words to folks at
right.
this point, because you got Ninshane, you got Sorene, and you have Calcatro. And again, those are kind of all immersive in-game language words that we hope kind of bring people into the world and get them invested in the process. Um, they're all alien words. I guess Calcatro is a good one to start off with there.
Yeah, so the closest thing to what you could analogize to the Calcatro to would be a psionicist. That's not really a great description, but it is close. Essentially, what a Calcatro does is um, will supernatural events to occur so strongly that they actually occur. And so it's almost like a believe the fireball into existence kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, it's it is a learned capability, but it's also something that doesn't necessarily um, it doesn't require any kind of inherent difference to the person. Like anyone, theoretically, any human being walking around could become a Calcatro in much the same way that anyone who wanted to go and spend years and years up on a mountaintop at some temple could learn to relax their body enough that they can slow their heart rate down to the point where they're indistinguishable from being dead. Most people just don't have the discipline to do that.
Right. Or
Um,
the time.
well, yeah, that it's like it's something that you can do. You're capable of doing it. It's just most people never will.
Right.
Um, what's interesting about Calcatro is their powers typically are weaker because they have a hard limit based off the mental attributes of the character, but they are incredibly fast, and it's very easy for them to learn new powers in game after creation. That
Mhm.
they just pull new powers out of nothing because they just believe that they can, essentially.
So that what you led off with there is an interesting contrast to the priest, right? The priests can access powers at very, very high ratings because they're asking for those powers from a divine source, and it might take a while. Whereas the Calcatro, their powers aren't going to be as strong, but they can use them much quicker.
Uh, yeah, and that gets into a little bit of the mechanics from a combat perspective, where your timing of powers, priest and mage powers, typically will take three what we call phases, um, which we don't want to get into too much, but Calcatro powers only take one phase to execute, and so they can just blast them every single phase or every single turn of combat. Um, the next um, Nayashi that we could discuss is Sorine. And this is also, even though the term is kind of out there, it's um, it's also fairly accessible as a concept. These are very much like mutants. These are individuals who their power is inherent to who they are, um, and they can't really separate themselves from their powers. So this would be, mechanically speaking, any vampire or werewolf or the Hulk or a superhero, Superman, any of those kinds of things, a mutant, any of those would all fall into the bucket of Sorine. Um, what's interesting about them is that certain types of powers work very, very well for them. Things like body powers, like claws or um, wings or something like that. Those are just always on, right? They don't
Right.
have to turn them on. They don't have to make a choice to use them. They're just always there.
And in contrast, somebody like a mage has to cast a spell that gives them wings, and while that spell is active, they might have those wings, but when the spell is over, the wings are gone. The Sorane just has wings.
Right. Yeah. And then the last um, Naosh that we could use or talk about is the Ninshane. And I find personally these are one of my personal favorites. I think they're very interesting conceptually. Um, within the story arc of the game world, um, the Earth becomes what is known as a flux world, and the flux is a concept that represents. It's almost like string theory. That it's all possible time streams and all possible events that could occur at any given moment are represented by the flux. And a Ninshane has the ability to essentially look into the flux, see the thing that they want to happen and pull it out into manifestation, is the way that it's described. Um, these have some really interesting kind of side effects in the way that the powers work, particularly with timing. Why don't you talk about that, Seth?
You mean like as far as the phase roll when you're activating powers?
Well, you don't have to go into the mechanics if you don't want to, but just the idea.
So the idea is that the flux is variable, and being able to reach into it to pull powers out, you sometimes it works a little bit more efficiently, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So that's one aspect of that Nayasch, is there's a bit of randomness that gets generated in how quickly powers might be accessible to a character.
Yeah. One thing that kind of offsets this essentially randomness, where, in some ways their power execution could be just as fast as a Calcatro. It could take much, much longer than any of the other Nayash. Um, but the other side is that it's relatively easy for them to gain new powers in game as well.
Mm.
And so that is part of where the mechanics kind of balance across each other. And so those are the tools that are used for balancing play, is how quickly can your powers manifest, how much effort does it take to learn new powers, those kinds of things.
So we talked about the 5 Nayash, and then we mentioned normal because you might want to play a character that doesn't have access to those. If you like to think in terms of comic book characters, Batman would be a normal character,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Highly competent, got a lot of access to wealth and training and stuff like that. So that lines up. There is another way to have powers, and it's worth mentioning, which is your racial powers, right? There's
Right.
or species powers, I suppose. Beyond human, there are other different species available for play in the game, and most of them have at least some powers available to them. They're minor, they're not game breaking by any means. Things like low light vision or thermal vision, fangs and horns. Gnomes kind of have this interesting feature where they can have access to the body part powers, body modification kind of ideas, and you can get those for a lower price if you're playing a gnome.
Yeah, and that gets into the story behind the gnomes, but it's an interesting process. And those species powers, I think, are an interesting way to kind of create a little bit more variety in the way that you can approach uh, play, and partly because many of those species powers are often linked to the character's level, which is actually something we're going to be talking about in a post next week about what that means to link something to level. So keep on the lookout for that. But it's a cool little tidbit there.
Yeah. So upcoming posts that we're excited about. We do have one coming out on Ninshene. We've got one coming out talking about level itself and what it does, and then we'll have one on what it means to link certain things to level.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think actually the level post itself came out yesterday, and then the linked one is next Thursday. Is the plan? Yeah.
So if all that sounds interesting, check out our Instagram and our Facebook. We're putting a little information out there. Ping us in the comments. Ask us questions. We're excited about this game. We're hoping to share that excitement with people and hope others get excited too. We're looking for engagement. This is a fun game. If you start playing it, we know that people are going to love it. So we welcome any and all questions and comments about it.
Yeah, for sure. Don't hesitate to, if you either leave a comment, feel free to shoot us a message, whatever you want to do. We'd love to engage with you and talk to you about our system, because we're doing this because we love the game, and we want to make it available to everybody else. So I think we're going to go ahead and drop off now. Thank you so much for sticking with us and having a little conversation with us about this. And we will talk to you later.
Yeah. See you, everybody. We'll see you in the comments.
All right. Bye.